My name is Owen Symes, and welcome to The Copagandists, a podcast about cop shows and the people who make them. Finally, we have arrived. Television, the maturation of the police procedural, the fruition of all that dramatic, propagandistic promise we first saw glimmers of back in the radio shows of the 1930s. So let's dig in to TV Dragnet. And we'll start with a question. Why might NBC have wanted to bring Dragnet to television in the first place? Maybe that seems like a stupid thing to ask, but adaptation takes work. Work costs money, and spending money entails risk. None of these things businesses particularly like. NBC and Jack Webb already had a successful thing going on radio, putting money, labor, and time towards adapting this to television might jeopardize that. So why bother? In answer, we should think of, a layer cake, pick your metaphor. At base, radio was seen as a dying medium, television as a growing one, especially for dramatic content. Getting a successful radio drama onto television thus made sense in terms of how people saw the evolution of mass media in the US. If we go up a level, there was also clearly an audience that existed for crime shows. We've already covered that to a great extent, this context of crime dramas on radio, film, and early television. The market was there. More importantly, for television in particular, being a new medium meant that there was still a great need for content. Stations just didn't have enough programming to fill all the hours of the day yet, so they would take anything they could get. So, commercial trends and commercial needs certainly played a big part in pushing Dragnet onto the small screen. Politics added yet another layer. You can think maybe the icing. Recall from a few episodes ago that the television industry was, in this period, increasingly beset by critics charging that the small screen was filled with sadism, violence, and perversion. This criticism was augmented by developments in Washington, D.C. In May of 1950, after a contentious vote, Democratic Senator Estes Kefauver established the Special Committee to investigate crime in interstate commerce. Over the next year, this committee held hearings in 14 cities, interviewing hundreds of witnesses, including testimonies from the denizens of the so-called criminal underworld, like Tony Anastasia and Frank Costello. Many of these hearings were broadcast on television, one of the first instances of national news being experienced by a large number of television viewers. Variety went so far as to characterize the hearings as a new and irresistible form of public entertainment. The hearings themselves highlighted for the white middle-class public the idea of organized crime as a subject of national concern, really for the first time since Prohibition. In sum, NBC was making these decisions within a context of heightened concern over the deleterious social effects of both televised and real crime. After an article in Variety gave further voice to public concern about all of this, Sam Kaufman of NBC's Press and Information Department shot off a memo to Sid Iges, Vice President for Public Information. Let's bring Dragnet out in a television version, presented in the same underplaying crime manner as the radio show. I think it would make a good program as well as a partial answer to the squawks of NBC TV affiliates. NBC's head censor, Stockton Helfrich, agreed, characterizing Dragnet as having enough class and artistic stature to impress the critics. Now, the ambitious Webb did not need much convincing to give this a try. There were quite a few details to work out, however, before the show could get to air. The first concerned the process of adaptation itself. What would they bring from radio? What would they leave? How might a different medium impact the stories that Webb wanted to tell? Ever the efficient producer, Webb opted to port over as much as he could from the radio production. Why change what worked? Chief among these was the continued importance placed upon dialogue, the drumbeat narration of Joe Friday, the questioning of witnesses, the interrogating of suspects, the discussion of the case among the investigators. The style of delivery remained as it had been on radio: brisk, monotone, volley-fired dialogue. What's often described as staccato dialogue. This continued emphasis on talking was reinforced right from the get-go when Webb made the decision that the TV broadcasts would be adaptations of existing radio scripts. Beginning right with the pilot episode, Webb would have his team pull a radio script, update it for television, film it. As the TV show would become more important over time, Webb would modify this process a little bit. When writing new scripts, they would first test it in radio, improve it, and then redo it for television later on. In so doing, Webb managed to integrate both radio and television into the same production pipeline. Quite efficient indeed. If the plots and much of the dialogue were to come from radio, what then would be different about TV Dragnet? How would Webb utilize visual language? Then head of NBC, Pat Weaver, later recalled that he actually cautioned Webb at the time about leaning too far away from his radio origins, of taking too many risks in the new medium, in television. I got Jack Webb to do Dragnet on TV. I knew Jack from radio. I said to Jack, don't listen to these idiots. They're all going to tell you to make this show more visual. What you've got is a good, strong structure with good characterization that works. Put it on the air like you've been doing it on radio, except remember now that you're not blind. You've got cameras so you can see the pictures of what you did, but don't change it too much. Whether Weaver actually gave this advice to Webb or not, or whether it had an impact on Webb's thinking, it is definitely the case that Dragnet's TV iteration would make some rather bold visual choices, ones that augmented the formula that had coalesced during the radio years. Notably, the show would make liberal use of many of the techniques popularized by the cycle of semi-documentary crime thrillers and by film noir that we covered a few episodes ago, most especially on-location shooting, montage, and high-contrast lighting. In addition to these tried-and-true cinematic techniques, Webb also innovated for television through the heavy use of close-ups, of focusing the camera right up in actors' faces. This reinforced the power of the vocal exchanges, while also working well within the technical limitations of early TVs, which were plagued by small screens and fuzzy images. Webb wanted visual clarity and did his best to achieve it within the meager means available to him. One thing that Webb did not want in this new television version was an increase in the action, in violence, something that the availability of Hollywood props and pyrotechnics would doubtless have made quite tempting. But as Webb put it to TV Guide in 1953, there never will be anything in Dragnet that I wouldn't want my own kids to see. Surprisingly, this didn't bother either the network executives or Webb's sponsor, which, given the history you've looked at earlier, might come as kind of a shock. Wasn't this the same period when advertisers were writing memos telling writers to add more murder into their shows? Hadn't NBC literally criticized Webb's radio pilot for being too boring? Yeah, but the combination of Radio Dragnet's ratings success and critical reception, people liked the low-key, low-action content apparently, plus the television show's political utility, meant that NBC was perfectly happy to air a show that, in its own quiet way, would be more prestigious and less pugilistic. In addition to the question of adapting a radio show to television was how the show would be televised in the first place. Would it be live, or would it be taped? Live TV, as you might recall from a couple episodes ago, was still very much in vogue in the early 1950s, even as filmed anthologies were gaining traction. In keeping with this trend, NBC initially wanted Dragnet to be broadcast live, just like any of its other prestige programs. Webb, however, resisted, preferring the control of film to the spontaneity of live. As he told Variety in 1958, "I've got a lot of respect for live television, but there are certain limitations I don't like. You can't light live properly. You need floor lamps to get in on a close-up, and there's no way to do it in a live show. I just think you can't get the technical perfection we can achieve shooting a film with a live technique." According to a Time article, Webb's insistence on recording episodes on film did not initially sway the network. Only the intercession of his sponsor, the Liggett and Myers Tobacco Corporation, won him the day. Under pressure from their target demographic, advertisers, NBC capitulated and agreed to shell out $38,000 for a pilot episode. So now we're on the air. The pilot, entitled The Human Bomb, was based on the 7th episode of the radio series, City Hall Bombing, which had aired back in July of 1949. Webb got last-minute permission from the LAPD to film inside their offices, which he did over the course of 2 days in October. He reviewed this initial footage, went back for 2 more days of reshoots, and that's when he really began to incorporate more close-ups into his visual style. So that's something that was in Dragnet pretty much right from the get-go. Now let's pause for a moment on this pilot episode, for this spare 29-minute adaptation of a radio script would turn out to be one of the most consequential TV broadcasts ever.
Ladies and gentlemen, the story you are about to see is true. The names have been changed to protect the innocent.
After the narrator intones that the story is true, the names change to protect the innocent, we jump right into Joe Friday's narration.
This is the city. 450 square miles of it. 150,000 acres. A big place. 6,000 miles of streets. 2 million people. In my job, you get a chance to meet them all. I'm a cop. This is the City Hall. The base is 476 feet on its longitudinal axis. The tower goes up 452 feet above the level of Main Street. They put it up to stay. Limestone from France, marble from Tennessee, gray California granite. It was Tuesday, November 15th. It was cold in Los Angeles. We'd been working the early watch out of Central Division, Detective Bureau. I got an emergency call to check back in at the office. An entire block in the heart of the city was facing sudden, total destruction. We had 26 minutes to try and stop it. This is the story of those 26 minutes.
After this, the episode then chronicles the LAPD's attempts to thwart a man who brought a bomb into City Hall, trying to get his brother sprung from prison. Right away, Joe Friday declares that guns are not the answer. Instead, the cops work methodically through a series of ideas, trying to talk the bomber down, leaving a dictaphone off the hook so they can surveil him clandestinely, rappelling down into the room to subdue the terrorist by surprise. Up until the very end, these attempts fail in various ways, but at long last, the perp is subdued and Friday is able to rush the bomb outside before its timer expires. With a touch of melodrama, Friday's life is spared when the bomb fails to detonate. Narration then tells us that the terrorist was subsequently found mentally incompetent, unable to stand trial. Now, NBC began airing Dragnet cautiously, so this episode aired December 16th, 1951, as a kind of preview. When it performed well, regular episodes began to air in January of 1952. The show initially would alternate with another TV adaptation from radio, Phillips Lord's venerable docudrama Gangbusters, which we touched on earlier. Incidentally, Dragnet's sponsor actually wanted a different show to rotate with Dragnet, Bob Hope, who turned down the Thursday time slot because he preferred Sunday nights. Like its competitor, Gangbusters advertised itself as fact-based, but relied more on sensationalism and thrill. Now, Gangbusters performed pretty well, finishing 8th in the ratings by the end of its first season, but NBC decided to cancel it and go all in on Dragnet, whose success had been even greater. Although Webb had initially been able to film within LAPD facilities, this obviously was not sustainable going forward, so he had his crew duplicate police offices and equipment as best they could. Per an article in Time magazine, these sets exactly simulate the offices at Los Angeles Police Department headquarters. The very calendars are the same. The phones bear the same extension numbers. Even the old-fashioned doorknobs are perfect duplicates. Over the coming years, Webb would work feverishly to crank out radio and television episodes, all while continuing to adhere to the detailed authenticity that had become a point of pride for him. Per a 1954 New York Times interview with co-star Ben Alexander, the show's shooting schedule was a grueling one. They filmed 2 half-hour episodes each week, working 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. While Webb did not cut corners as far as props and sets were concerned, he did utilize one surprising device to speed things up: the teleprompter. Now, he justified its use as a way to push actors towards delivering their lines in a cool, professional manner. But it did have the added benefit of removing the need to memorize lines, which saved precious labor time and energy that Webb could ill afford to waste. He also refused, as a general rule, to do rehearsals, again with the justification that it augmented authenticity, but with the added benefit that it saved time. Instead of rehearsals, Webb would shoot multiple takes if things did not meet his expectations. One critic, visiting Webb's set in the winter of 1952, observed that while most TV directors barely did any retakes, Webb did up to 5 or 6 per scene. And you might think this was a waste of time, why not just rehearse? But I think because Webb could set things up very quickly, get actors back in their cues, and just have them read from teleprompters over and over again, it was quicker for him to just repeat scenes a couple of times versus trying to rehearse it and get it perfect before the cameras rolled. This work pace allowed him to crank out a lot of content, but it did take a toll on Webb's relationships. It strained his marriage. It pushed out radio mainstays like producer William Rousseau and writer Jim Moser, who had worked so closely with Webb to bring Dragnet to radio. Some of these former co-workers Webb apparently felt were little more than dead weight. He griped to Time magazine in 1954, "Hollywood is full of guys who are expert at riding on your back and putting their hands in your pocket. What the hell have they done since they left me? You just show me their track records." Other crime dramas had been modest successes, profitable successes, but Dragnet was the first to really smash the ratings. It finished 4th in its first season, sometimes playing to 48% of the national audience for a given evening. It remained in the top 10 for its first 4 seasons straight, often vying with I Love Lucy for the top spot. Prestige accompanied popularity, with Dragnet being the first police procedural to win an Emmy. It received 3 consecutive ones for Best Mystery, Action, or Adventure Program. And just as it happened when Dragnet first appeared on radio, when it premiered on television, the majority of critics continued to praise its low-key authenticity, its mundane realism. Reviewing the premiere a few days after it aired, the New York Times wrote that it appears destined for a new success on television, which they chalked up to its dramatic authenticity. There was no speech-making nor emotional histrionics, only the cryptic and pertinent observations of the officials as they raced against the clock. Dragnet sticks to the point, which perhaps is the secret of its attraction. In 1954, Jack Webb's face splashed across the cover of Time magazine. In that issue, in an article called Jack Be Nimble, always creative, the magazine characterized Webb's creation as a slice-of-life drama that refrained from dramatic artifice, thus achieving a different kind of dramatic effect. It attracted audiences not through a reliance on murder and mayhem, but by making the television screen a sort of peephole into the grim new world. Other critics, however, were less impressed, especially when it came to race. They noted that Webb's show was as lily-white as anything else on segregation-era television. One viewer criticized this racial erasure. "I defy you to get into the Los Angeles City Hall, the stations in the trouble areas, without seeing persons of color or of minorities working in all sorts of capacities, both male and female. It makes you quite proud to see those of all colors and creeds working together, but not as Jack Webb portrays them." The Afro-American noted sarcastically, "It's really nice to know that the Dragnet world in which Jack Webb travels as Sergeant Friday is entirely free of colored sinners, but it's too bad that his lack of objectivity deprives some tan actors of work." Now some, such as Webb scholar Michael Hyde, have since defended this lack of racial diversity on the grounds of accuracy. After all, the LAPD was not desegregated until 1961. But as Claudia Calhoun points out, that does not account for the overwhelming whiteness of everyone else on the show. Despite the fact that LA's population was by 1960 at least 45% non-white, Dragnet spent its decade on the air only intermittently traveling to those neighborhoods, touching upon those people and their problems. And of course, when it did take a detour from its ivory highway onto a colored rest stop, it made sure to portray police interactions with these communities as professional, if not downright harmonious, a subject we will return to in a later episode. This racial blind spot accidentally segues nicely into our final section, the cultural ubiquity Dragnet achieved in these years. This is thanks to a 1954 observation by William Reaver of the Motion Picture Herald. "Dragnet is to television at this point what Birth of a Nation was to the silent motion picture for a span of its best years. Its 2 half-hours on television, plus its half-hour on radio, give Dragnet a saturation no other dramatic presentation has matched heretofore, or is likely to hereafter." This ubiquity was very real and went beyond mere ratings figures. As noted by one paper at the time, viewers not only tuned in, but believed in the show, with an alarming number going so far as to think that Sergeant Friday was fucking real, like a real cop. To quote one paper, "Incidentally, so many people believe that Sergeant Friday is a real policeman that the Los Angeles Police Department has a stock answer to one question they hear often. Whenever a woman fan, why just the women? Whenever a woman fan phones and asks to speak with him, the officer on duty says, 'Sorry, ma'am, but this is Sergeant Friday's day off.'" Viewers also expressed their love for the show via the veritable Vesuvius of fan mail, which by 1954 was reported to be piling up for Jack Webb at the studio, and even those with strange addresses can't keep the Los Angeles mailman from delivering them. One letter merely had the familiar dum-da-dum-dum on the envelope, and on another was written, instead of the address, the even more familiar, "Just give me the facts, ma'am." And that phrase itself, "just the facts, ma'am," became part of the cultural lexicon for decades afterwards. This saturation moved quickly beyond radio and television. A Dragnet comic strip began publication in 1952, reaching more than 30 papers across the country. This was apparently the brainchild of Rex Barley, executive manager of the Mirror Syndicate of newspapers, who first got the idea around March of 1951, actually before Dragnet had even made it to television. It took him 3 months to work out an agreement with Webb, at which point he went searching for an artist, interviewing more than 24 people before finally landing on 26-year-old Joe Scheiber. And this poor young Joe Scheiber had his work cut out for him. For example, while preparing for an early strip, Webb had the artist redraw an entire sequence. The reason? Well, I'll let the Los Angeles Mirror describe it, as my own meager descriptive talents simply fail to convey the enormity of the error. A criminal file was shown as being contained in a black manila envelope, but when Chief of Detectives Thad Brown pointed out to Webb that such files are kept in white envelopes, the artist was ordered to make it right. Advertising this upcoming strip, the Los Angeles Mirror subsequently declared, "Dragnet, the only authentic police story, has been adapted for a comic strip, and the Mirror's got it. Sergeant Joe Friday, known to millions from coast to coast as the chief character in this prize-winning radio and TV show, will appear 6 days a week in this paper and more than 30 others across the nation. Every line of dialogue and every piece of art is checked by top officials to ensure accuracy." Now, these comic cases would be new, never before adapted, and would be, promised the paper, selected for their variety and perfect adaptation to comic strip medium. Now, I know what you're thinking, but fear not. I know some comics rot kids' brains, but these were not going to turn them toward a life of crime. Because Dragnet does not glorify the criminal. The reader solves every case, step by step, with the law. Well, thank goodness for that. Upon the strip's premiere, the Los Angeles Mirror went so far as to enlist the testimony of Thad Brown himself, the real chief of detectives. In addition to assuring readers that these comics were, like the show, reproduced from real cases with 100% accuracy, Detective Brown added, "As police officers, we insist that the true story be told. No phony private eye stuff, no tricks, no devices, no hokum. We are proud of our detective division and are glad the public has this opportunity to share, in day-to-day panels, the stories we have worked and lived." Although never a major success, this comic did run for a solid 3 years, ending in 1955. 1954 saw an especially unusual move, the adaptation of Dragnet into a feature film. While a few other TV properties had made the jump to cinema, it wasn't common. The unusualness of this production explains why the Motion Picture Herald wrote in early 1954, "This is to be an all-out filming for theatrical exhibition at paid admissions of a dramatic material that is customarily filmed for exhibition via television with no admission charged to the audience." In other words, the jury was still out on whether people would pay actual money to see a big picture version of stuff that they could just watch at home for free. We're actually having similar conversations about that these days with streaming versus movie theaters. Dragnet was a good candidate for feature filmification. Not only was it immensely popular, but it sat comfortably within a genre that had been the subject of cinematic treatment for decades. As the Herald concluded, "This ought to tell once and for all whether the theater screen can make profitable use of television materials." Riding high on the success both in radio and television, Webb managed to maintain a large degree of creative control over the Dragnet movie, up to and including directing, casting, and picking the writer. Upon release, the Dragnet movie became a rousing success, recouping more than 10 times its production budget in its initial theatrical run alone. Critically, however, it did not perform as well, with some asserting that it did not bring anything new or innovative to the table. The Saturday Review went so far as to lambaste the film not only for Friday's surprisingly grumpy attitude towards policing, but also his evident disdain for civil rights and due process. As interpreted and directed by Jack Webb, Friday is a grimly righteous man. Yet, like other recent movie cops who break the law in the name of enforcing it, he bemoans the low pay and long hours, the risks and inadequate rewards. He obviously derives little satisfaction from delivering up criminal types for trial, complaining bitterly that his job is unnecessarily complicated by grand jury demands for legal proof of guilt, by the laws against wiretap evidence, and by the trapped criminal's recourse to the Fifth Amendment. His glib arguments for the removal of these constitutional obstacles in the path of good policemen are alarmingly forthright and unsubtle. Even without the arguments, Joe seems to be waging his war against crime with tactics that might have come directly out of Gangland's own guidebook. In addition to all of these forms of mass media, merchandise also made an appearance. Various toy companies licensed the property, really without much input from Jack Webb himself, which explains some of these toys. The Knickerbocker Toy Company released a number of them, including a series of Dragnet guns, despite the fact that the show wasn't very violent. These included water pistols, cap guns, dart guns, and even a Toy Riot shotgun. They also made a Dragnet radar game and a toy version of Joe Friday's badge. Transagram Toy Company released a board game, a puzzle, and a crime lab, which included all of the essentials of forensic analysis: a microscope, fingerprint kit, a gun, a badge, handcuffs. Wait, okay. I don't think I know what forensics means. Even Kellogg's got in on the action, not only by packaging Dragnet whistles with its cereal, God help those parents, but also by sponsoring the show in certain markets. Towards the end of the decade, Webb even published a Dragnet book, The Badge, $4.95 from Prentice Hall, which purported to be a look under the hood of the LAPD itself, while also presenting readers with cases too hot for television, like the so-called Black Dahlia murder of 1948. Reviews were positive, if not glowing, with one paper noting that Webb's 11 years of research qualify him as an expert. The Badge impresses even the layman that here is an expertly done work on policemen. Even if, as the reviewer noted, some of the writing scolded the reader for not being more anti-crime. Dragnet's cultural power hit its high water mark, however, in 1956, when Chuck Jones and his Looney Tunes came out with a parody starring Porky Pig and Daffy Duck called Rocket Squad. It begins with the title card: "Ladies and gentlemen, the story you are about to see is true. The drawings have been changed to protect the innocent."
This is the Milky Way, a nice galaxy. 875 billion trillion people live here. Yes, it's a nice place to live. It's my job to keep it that way. I'm a space cop. My name's Monday. My partner's name is Tuesday. He always follows me. With Wednesday, January 23rd, 10:26 p.m.
It's 10:28.
Like I said, it was 10:28 p.m. We were returning from a routine investigation in the Big Dipper area. A 712. Malicious mischief. School children had blown the ring off Saturn. When will parents learn to keep uranium out of their children's reach?
Yeah, when?
Released in March, the episode depicted Daffy as Sergeant Joe Monday and Porky as Detective Schmo Tuesday. Interestingly, the plot has the pair ultimately sued for false arrest, ending with their imprisonment. It is lovely. Everyone should go watch it. Radio, television, film, toy, book, duck. Dragnet spread itself across the Eisenhower years as few media properties had before. But it could not last forever. The later seasons, beset by imitators and suffering from Webb's creative fatigue, suffered both in the ratings and in the press. It's probably a good thing, then, that Dragnet finally did end. After 314 episodes, the radio series went first, wrapping up in July of 1957. The TV show lasted a little longer, ending in August of 59, although it only managed a paltry 276 episodes. As the decade drew to a close, Webb would claim considerable success, not only transitioning a property from radio to television, but from television to film, and a dozen other mediums and materials besides. He had created a cultural institution. But every ending is really just a point of transition. Where would Webb go from here? Where Dragnet? Where will we? A lot of questions remain open to us, which we will deal with piecemeal in the weeks ahead. For now, we'll stick with Dragnet, discussing in greater detail its relationship to realism, its stature as a piece of art, its success as a piece of commercial product, and its power as an ideological vehicle, as a cornerstone of modern propaganda. Once done, we'll be able to continue the narrative of Webb's career and how he tried to follow up such an incredible success. Thanks for listening to this week's episode covering TV Dragnet. Next week I'll be off, but when we come back in April, we'll continue our coverage of Dragnet by delving into the question of realism. Sources are in the show notes below. You can find an essay version of this script, complete with detailed citations, on my Substack at Owen Symes. Find me at Blue Sky, Owen-Symes, YouTube, Integral History. You can also check out my book, He Was Our Man in Washington, A History of the Obama Years. Music by Carl Casey at White Bat Audio. See you next time.